Hello, everybody. Mr. Rogers here with another video. Today, we're going to be talking about the Declaration of Independence. We already covered the Stamp Act crisis in Checkpoint 1, and we've covered sort of the Enlightenment and the long-term origins of the Declaration in Checkpoint 2. And this video is going to be directly about the American Declaration of Independence, which will lead you into your work on Checkpoint 3. But to cover it today, I've actually brought my friend, Dr. Michael Hattem, to come and talk to us today about the Declaration and some of the high-flying, high-end topics about it at a very general level to give us an overview of the Declaration, its origins, how it was drafted, and its long-term impact. So before we dig in, I thought I'd give Dr. Hattem a chance to introduce himself. So Michael, tell us a little bit about you.
So, hello, everyone. My name is Michael Hattem. I am currently I am a visiting assistant professor at Knox College, which is in Galesburg, Illinois. Before I came here, I taught for a year at the New School in New York City, and all of that came after receiving my PhD in early American history from Yale University.
Cool. All right. So let's just jump right in then, Michael, and talk about the long-term origins of the Declaration of Independence. So we've already learned a little bit about the Enlightenment and how it impacted some of the ideas that went behind that, famous statement in the Declaration that all men are created equal. But I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about that and expand upon it so we can understand it a little bit more in depth.
Yeah. So I think that there's really three key sort of Enlightenment ideas that underpin the Declaration, and especially the sort of introduction and the preamble. And those three Enlightenment ideas are the social contract, the ideas of liberalism, and the idea of natural law. So we'll say a little bit about each of those quickly. The idea of the social contract comes from the notion that when people come together to institute a government, to institute a society, that they are doing that and in a way in which they are giving some kind of meaningful assent, like they are saying, yes, we want to be part of this society or this government, right? And the reason that this idea of the social contract came about, especially in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, is because Enlightenment thinkers were trying to understand the origins of government in a way that did not rely on the older explanations for the origins of government, which basically, in European terms, has to do with this old idea of the divine right of kings, right? That the governments that existed, the monarchies that existed in Europe, existed that way because that's how God wanted them to be, right? And that's why the rulers were determined by heredity, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so these thinkers came up with this idea of the social contract because they asked themselves, how did people originally institute these governments, right? And the idea of the social contract is built on this idea that when you establish a government, or a society, you do it in a way that you give assent, right, to join that. And typically that also can mean that you agree to give up certain rights, right, that you might have if there were no government, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that in return for that, you receive something back of important value. And for people in the 18th century, these Enlightenment thinkers, the main thing of value that you get from the social contract is basically the security of your person,
Mm-hmm.
and your property, right?
Yep.
Meaning you don't have to worry about somebody coming and killing you and taking your stuff, basically.
And assaulting your family, right? And
Yeah.
life, liberty, and property, right? We read that when we read some John Locke, right? Which is saying that people voluntarily chose to form governments to protect those things, in a way that, like, the way people like Locke thought about it, right, was if that was common sense, right, where everybody, whether you were European, African, American, Asian, you understood those basic things, right? People shouldn't steal my stuff, they shouldn't murder me, they shouldn't assault my family. And then that if a government isn't stopping people from that, it's not much of a government at all.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, you have to, we have to remember, I mean, that in the 18th century, um, property, private property, is a relatively, sort of new idea in the modern sense of it, right? And so the idea of securing property was that much more important. But again, I want to stress that this all goes back to these philosophers' desire to find an alternative origin for government, right? That did not rely on monarchy or divine right, or like godly ordained monarchy.
Right. If
Right.
if God had anything to do with it, he created all people equal, and thus they could all have an equal right to be in government, right?
Right.
Not that God picked one chosen person, a king, a Harry Potter, or whatever, to rule society.
Yeah, because you think about what the problem is with that, right? In the divine right mode, if you're thinking that way, well, then that means that if the king is divinely appointed, then that means whatever the king does is beyond question, except by God, right?
Yep.
And that means that the king can basically do whatever they want, and there's really nobody has any recourse to do anything about it, and that would include taking your property, or or any of those other horrible eventualities that we discussed earlier, right? So this idea of the social contract was really fundamental at this time in the 18th century. But there's lots of ways that you can we can see this idea of the social contract and debates about it occurring up until the present. It's part of, right? Is it part of the is it part of your responsibility, your part in the social contract, to practice social distancing, things like that, right?
Oh yeah.
We see people claiming that it is, and we see people claiming that it isn't. So this idea of the social contract, as long as we have non-monarchical societies, it's always going to remain an important and debated concept.
Cool. Yep. Yeah. I think that's pretty great discussion about this, and it definitely hits on what we talked about when we read Locke and we read Thomas Paine and the arguments that they made against monarchy and making sure that government is representative, right? That's related to that with the social contract theory, that government isn't, since it's not coming directly from God, coming directly from the wisdom of a king, it's coming from everyone who are created equal. It's supposed to represent the interests of those people, and when it doesn't, you run into issues.
Yeah, and it's also, I mean, an important part of it's an important component of the ways in which, since the revolution, that we've come to think about representative government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right, because that part of what you give up in the social contract in a representative democracy is the ability to vote on law, is the ability as a citizen, for all citizens to vote on everything, and you transfer that that authority, or that right to your elected representative.
Absolutely. I think with this thing we can use this to transition to thinking about how the Declaration as a document came to be, is that one really important thing about social contract theory is that we've talked about, we've hinted at, but we might want to explore a little bit more, is what happens when government breaks the social contract, right? The colonists, particularly with some of the big events, we talked specifically about the Stamp Act, but we learned a little bit about other ones like the Proclamation Line and other things like that. Some colonists came to really see that the British government was, one, out of touch with their needs. The Paine argument, right? They're in London. They don't know what's going on in America. If they do know, it's 6 months, 8 months, a year out of date. Two, the decisions that they are making aren't in our best interests. So it's not even just that they aren't informed about us, it's that the decisions that they are making are not in Americans' best interests. So how does that, I guess you could say, concrete complaints of colonists tie in with that concept of the social contract?
Yeah, so I mean, and this is also where where the other idea of liberalism sort of comes in, and where we see that in the Declaration, in the preamble, is in that phrase, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Right?
Hmm.
It's changed from Locke's property into this idea of happiness, and basically what that has to do with is this idea that you know, happiness is not a well defined term in the context of the Declaration. Right? It's a personal thing. Happiness in this context means you being able to pursue your own interests,
Hmm.
right? Your own self-interest, and uh, clearly the colonists over the course of the 1760s and the 1770s, increasingly felt that their ability to pursue those interests was being unreasonably limited by the British government, right? Whether that's the proclamation line, right, restricting them from moving westward, or these, acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, which had to do with economic self-interest. So, this idea of the social contract and this idea of happiness are sort of intertwined, and you can see that as we get into the 1770s. There's an escalation in the crisis that takes place right around 1773, and what happens really is that the Parliament passes a Tea Act, right, which is basically meant to bail out the East India Tea Company, right, which is struggling at this time, and so the Parliament decides that they're going to pass a tea act that will lower the tax on tea, on this East India tea specifically, as a way of trying to get the colonists to buy that tea instead of the smuggled tea that
They
uh,
enjoyed.
that was the source of much of their happiness. Uh, and so colonists responded to that, in the famous Boston Tea Party, right, where they unloaded many pounds of this East India tea that had been shipped into the Boston Harbor. And it's worth noting, we always talk about the Boston Tea Party. Many colonial cities had their own tea parties. They didn't always dump the tea in the water. Sometimes it got held in other places, but basically the effect was the same. But basically, in response to the Boston Tea Party, the destruction of basically Parliament's property in this tea, Parliament responded by passing a number of acts that were called the coercive acts, in which the colonists called the intolerable acts. And this is in 1774, right? And basically, they shut down the Massachusetts colonial government and the town governments, right? They also shut down the harbors, so basically ended trade going in and out of Boston, which was like an economic sanction, right? Effectively.
Because
So
that's
these
where
are
Boston
really,
made a lot of its money, right? And
yeah,
many
Boston is
Bostonians were tied
trading
into
town.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, whether they're trading with the Caribbean or they're trading back with England, I mean, these colonial cities, they were enmeshed in these almost global, right, economic networks. And so when you close the harbor of a city like Boston, you're inflicting significant, right, injury on people. And so these were such drastic actions, the coercive acts were, and so unprecedented an action by Parliament towards the colonies, that it led to the creation of the Continental Congress in 1774. And this is the body that eventually will produce the Declaration of Independence and independence itself.
Right. And I mean, if we're looking for modern parallels, like we are talking about earlier, right, you have Parliament bailing out a failing but well-connected enterprise,
Yeah,
and the decision of the government to do that spiraling out of control as people realize that the high cost that they're going to have to bear and the change in their lifestyle that they're going to have to bear, their pursuit of happiness in order to sort of make corporate profits. And this was hundreds of years ago, but parliamentarians knew or were making money off this East India
yeah,
Company, right? People in government. So
yeah,
it wasn't even bailing their friends out. In some cases, it was bailing themselves out. Um,
yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, we can see the modern parallels, in 2008, right, with the failure of the banks and the bailouts of the banks. Um,
Or
so this,
2006 or 2020 and what's going
or
on right now.
or
So,
2020, yeah, and yeah, I mean, this is it's an unfortunate situation, but it's not it is a not uncommon, right,
mhm.
situation. And the idea is, I mean, we should almost never be shocked when people who hold power use that power to benefit themselves,
Mhm.
right? And this is a big part of why colonists were so disturbed by what was happening, is because they had held these ideas for a long time that historians refer to as republicanism. But the idea basically was that to be a virtuous citizen, right? That meant you put the public good
Mhm.
above your own self-interest, right? Now, this especially goes for people in positions of power, people, in the colonial governments, people in parliament. If everybody just went to the parliament or to their colonial assembly and did what was best for them, how could that possibly produce an outcome that was positive for everybody else, right? And so basically, with parliament acting in this way, it convinced many colonists that basically, the people in parliament were just so corrupt, right,
Mhm.
and so out for themselves that uh, there was really no way to redeem them from that, right? And that sense built over the course of 1774 and 1775, and ultimately led to independence, right?
So, what what led in Congress? So we talked a little bit about the creation of Congress, and so what factors in Congress made independence possible? Uh, what? How did it actually, as a process, get about happening? So we've talked about some of the big structural issues, talking about liberalism, talking about the Enlightenment, and then we've talked about some specific events like the Tea Party, the Stamp Act,
Mm-hmm.
these coercive acts. But how did the men here where I am? You're in Illinois, but I'm here in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
How did the men who were sent to Philadelphia to represent their colonies, soon to be states, how did they get about doing the work of declaring independence?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a long process, right? I mean, it takes almost 2 years from the time that they first assemble in 1774 until the point where they're declaring independence, and a lot happens in between then. But I think what's important to remember is that it is a process that these represented these delegates to the Continental Congress. They did almost none of them went there, thinking, we need to declare independence,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Many of them were going there with the intention of coordinating, with the rest of their sort of sister colonies, a process of, um, what's the word I'm looking for?
Cooperation,
Uh,
coordination,
yeah, uh, um, what's the word?
confederation.
No, I'm having a brain freeze at the moment. Reconciliation.
There we go. Reconciliation with England or
Yeah,
Britain.
they're
I mean,
they're getting together initially to think, okay, how can we figure out a way to make this right? To get Parliament and or the King to recognize, these issues, these things that we think are important, with no, real intention in 1774 at least to declare independence. But along the way, the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that one of the things that happens along the way is that a war breaks out,
yeah.
right? I mean, Lexington and Concord, which are the first, sort of official military battles of the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, those happened in April of 75, right? So from April of 75 until July of 76, the Congress is in this weird position of where they're kind of prosecuting a war with the British Army, right? Because they have a Continental Army by this point, uh, and yet also at the same time they're trying to, uh, they're trying to facilitate reconciliation, and it's this really sort of impossible situation. But the process that happens in the Congress is built off that, because over the course of 75, there is a nucleus of people in the Congress who see independence coming, right? The Massachusetts delegation, of course, right? But others, I mean, there are others from Virginia who see that as well. But there are still lots of delegates who are convinced that reconciliation is the only way forward.
Mm-hmm.
The process of getting some kind of consensus to independence, it took that long. It took well over a year of lots and lots of debates. It was a political process. It's about convincing. How do I convince people of my perspective? And it took a long time. I think really the turning point comes at the end of 75, right? In October of 75, this is now 6 months after war has begun, and the Congress sends one last petition for reconciliation, right?
The olive branch petition, it's known as, right?
Right. The olive branch petition, and this is many of the delegates understood that this was going to be the sort of was probably going to be the last chance at reconciliation, right? And what happens is, they wait all the time that it takes for their petition to go to England and come back, and at the end of the year, I think the last week of December, the King's proclamation, about this petition is received in the colonies, and basically the King says everybody in the Congress is a rebel, right? Which means that if they are caught, that they can be hung for that. That's treason, basically treason against the British Empire. And the proclamation also called on all of the, well-meaning,
right thinking
subjects of the King, to do whatever they can to stop what the Congress is trying to do, right? And it's at that moment when the members of Congress realize that, there's nowhere to go from here, basically. Right. And it's really like within a week or two that Thomas Paine's Common Sense is published in Philadelphia.
Right. And so gradually, it's as much events as it is debate, right? Over time, just the ground for trying to do a middle position is really just pulled out from under a lot of Americans, right? Yeah. The natural, people don't like change, right? Particularly for, the people who were in a position to make these decisions were relatively comfortable middle or upper class people. It's very difficult for, when you're comfortable to want change, right? Particularly a radical change, like not being part of the most powerful government in the world, right? Yeah. There were some, obviously, people who were willing to commit, but over time, events make it so you're not going to be comfortable no matter, if you don't make a choice. You either take the risk of getting more comfort by joining the American or the Patriot cause, or you act conservatively and stay with the Loyalist cause, but now you have to make a decision. So it's a combination of those debates, but it's also events just overtaking people's natural conservatism.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, the situation became so extraordinary, right, that basically the moderate position, the radical position through 75 was basically, pursue the war effort and ultimately move to independence. But the moderate position was towards reconciliation, and that just became increasingly an increasingly impossible position to take. So we've been talking a lot about, the Continental Congress, and the Continental Congress is important, right? Because it made official sort of decisions, but it's important to remember and to know that the process that's happening, this movement towards independence that's occurring, is not just happening in the Congress, right? It's happening outside of the Congress, what historians sometimes call out of doors, right? People were moving towards independence over the second half of 1775. And one of the ways that we know that is from a really fascinating book that was published 20 years ago by Pauline Maier, is a very well-known highly respected historian of the American Revolution, where she basically uncovered um, what what she came to call local declarations of independence, right? Which are towns and counties throughout the colonies, publishing their own uh, uh, resolves or their own, sort of a official statement of the county, uh, uh, calling for separation, calling for separation from Britain, and she uncovered dozens and dozens of these from most of them are from the first half of 1776, but we have some from even in 1775, and so it's just a good reminder that the story about the move towards independence, it's much broader than the Continental Congress, and it's much broader than the Continental Army and what's happening militarily. It's really a story that enveloped a significant portion of the population of the colonies in making this move, and in doing so, they actually helped to push the Congress, who was more moderate overall than the more patriot part of the population. So it's a good example of how popular opinion, public opinion, can move things at a very high political level.
Right, and there's
And
like a
also, I want to say, it's also an excellent example of how the work of historians can even, I mean, before Pauline Maier wrote this book, which is called American Scripture. Before she wrote that book, 20 years ago, there had already been thousands of books written about the Declaration of Independence, right? And we never really had any sense of the existence of these local declarations of independence before that. But she uncovered these, and it's a really good example of how, the work that historians do, the research that historians do, can change how we think about something as as important and as covered as the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to think about it as like a conversation that's going on where you have people on the ground, out of doors, to use the term you used, in the Philly, Independence Yard, all these kind of things, making their voices heard, and then Congress taking that back out, and then Congress making decisions that then cause the people to react. So there's this back and forth where they're push and pull between the two forces here. It's not one or the other. Like, you wouldn't have had independence entirely if it had just been what was going on in the streets, but there would definitely not have been the sort of support for the people who are pushing for independence if it had been no action in the streets. So I think it's like it's a conversation is a good way to think about what's going on in the run up to the Declaration.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, and if we think about it, a big part of the colonists' grievances with Britain was that the Parliament and the King were not responding to their public opinions, basically, right? Whether it was about the Stamp Act or the Tea Act or whatever. And so the Congress, also had some sense of, that they would have to be responsive, right, to public opinion to some extent, right?
Yeah,
and because of the way that things had gone up until that point.
Absolutely. So let's transition like a little bit though to talking about back indoors again, to go back to your metaphor. Close the doors again a little bit, because it was a closed door process. What we're going to be talking about here, which is the actual writing of the Declaration of Independence, the infamous or famous, depending on how you want to think about it, words. Who was responsible for them? How did that come about?
Yeah, so this is another process, right? I think if you ask most people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, they'll say Thomas Jefferson. And that's sort of right, but not really, right? Thomas Jefferson wrote the original draft of the Declaration. The task for the draft was assigned to a committee that included Benjamin Franklin and John Adams, and then they in turn assigned the task to Jefferson. So he wrote a first draft over a very short space of time, maybe a few nights, really. Obviously, these were things that he had been thinking about for a long time. He had already participated in writing, helping to draft the Virginia State Constitution, right?
And he wrote a big, famous propaganda piece listing grievances against Great Britain.
Right,
so.
right, a summer review.
Yep.
summary review of the rights of British America. That was 2 years earlier. So yeah, so he it was what he had to write. Most of what he had to write was already percolating, right, for a good while. So he put this all down on paper in a couple of days, and then it gets, the way that that Congress worked was that the committee produced this document, which was Jefferson's draft, and it went to what was called the Committee of the Whole, which basically meant that the document went before the entire Congress, and anybody could suggest changes, they could suggest edits, and they debated Jefferson's draft quite vigorously over the space of a couple of days. And there were significant changes that were made to the document over this time, enough that it's not really accurate to say that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And I think some of these changes are significant enough to warrant talking about them. Of course, the most famous change that occurred from the original draft is Jefferson had included a passage. We know the grievances section, right, of the Declaration that lists the 24 or so grievances that colonists had with the king and with Parliament. And one of them that Jefferson included basically put the blame for the transatlantic slave trade on the king, right? He said in the draft, he says, talking about the king, he says, he has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, right? So he's basically laying the blame for the slave trade on the king. And it's also clearly a very, it's also a critique of the slave trade itself, right?
Yeah.
So, sort of inherently. And, it's not hard to imagine, the delegates from the Congress who were from South Carolina or who were from Georgia or North Carolina.
Jefferson's own colleagues in Virginia.
Or in Virginia, saying, let's wait a minute here, right? And eventually, that whole section, and it was one of the longest grievances in the original draft, the Congress cut it.
And I think this is something we're going to talk about in class when we talk about the grievance section, which we're going over in detail. They keep in, of course, the grievance that points to one of the things the king did was stir up domestic insurrection, which of course is a fancy way of saying slave rebellions. And it's an interesting tension that's in Jefferson's original draft and what went through Congress about where they made the cuts and what they kept in.
So what they're referring to, not only but specifically, is the famous Dunmore Proclamation.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Right. Dunmore was the royal governor of Virginia, and he issued a proclamation late 75 that basically offered freedom to any enslaved persons in Virginia who could escape and make their way to the British camp and then serve the British Army.
Right. Largely men.
Largely men. Though not only.
Not only, no.
Right? Yeah. And there's been a lot of interesting work by historians done on that in the last few years, including the role of women who tried to make that, who tried to take up that offer. Another thing that's interesting about that passage is Jefferson included a passage about domestic insurrections, right? But it was changed by the Congress to include a mention of Native Americans, right? Jefferson did not include that. The grievance is, he's excited domestic insurrections among us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers, the merciless Indian savages, right?
A little clunky for Thomas Jefferson.
So that's not something that he would necessarily write, but that's something that, came from the Congress itself. So we can, you get a sense of what Jefferson wanted, certainly from the original draft, but from the later draft, the official the final version, you very much get a sense of of, of what was on the mind of the rest of the delegates and how they wanted this thing that they were doing to be framed,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And that brings up an interesting point about who the audience for the Declaration was.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the grievances section is, and that's why we're going to be spending so much time talking about it in class, I think is fundamental to understanding the audience for it and the initial case that's being made for independence, right? There's, it's like a push and pull in that grievance section. Many of them will, resonate to us today, but other ones, like, of course, the as we talked about, the merciless savage clause, the domestic insurrection clause, these are all things that kind of are easy to skim over, or if you want, or abhorrent to us today in the
Yeah.
21st century. But I think were really important at the time, right? Because a lot of people were white people, were scared about societal change that could come from the revolution, that it could upset the hierarchies that placed people of European descent above people of African and Native descent. And this is in many ways kind of like a assurance that that's not going to happen. That's saying it's actually the king's fault that there's this instability, right?
Yeah.
The king is the one who stirred up the domestic insurrections and brought these merciless Indian savages down upon us.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it effectively tries to absolve the colonists themselves of
Mm-hmm.
blame, right? Uh, for the way that Native Americans reacted to their own actions, right? It's to say, well, this is on the king, in the same way that the slave trade, that the Jefferson's original grievance against the slave trade, basically tried to absolve the colonists of any blame for the existence of slavery in the colonies. And so, in terms of the audience, um, the document is fascinating, partly because it has multiple audiences,
Mm-hmm.
right? Obviously, one of the audiences is the Jefferson's fellow colonists and the Congress's fellow colonists, but they're really not the primary audience, right? I mean, they're the primary audience to know that the Congress is declaring independence, but really the reasons why, that's aimed much more at an international audience, right? Whether it's part of it is the British people, right? It's because they still anticipated, they had hoped to be able to win over popular opinion in Britain to bring pressure onto Parliament to resolve this. That didn't happen. But another important audience is Europe itself, right?
Yeah, France in
Because
particular.
yeah, France and Spain in particular. I mean, these were the long-standing enemies of England, Britain, and the colonies, right? These were Catholic empires, and but they knew. I mean, the members of Congress who were most clear thinking at this time, knew that if they were going to wage full-scale war against Britain, which was the most powerful, had the most powerful military in the world at the time, they were going to need some help to do that,
Yeah.
right? And who could they possibly turn to? Was going to be either France or Spain or some combination of both. And the Declaration, you can't ask another country, another empire, to help you if you haven't already declared yourselves to be your own thing in the first place, right? So part of it does that, and then also, there's a lot of very specific charges in the grievances against the king, but if you'll notice, there's not really an anti-monarchical language, right? All the things that Jefferson talks about in the beginning of the Declaration could effectively, be the case under a monarchy, right? The Declaration is not creating a government. It's not the Constitution. It's not saying, here's the new government that we're going to form. It's going to have a House. It's going to have a Senate. It's going to have a president. It doesn't do any of that, right? And so it's really not setting up a anti-monarchical government. And that's important because France and Spain had
Had
kings.
kings, yeah.
They had absolute kings, divine right kings, right?
Even more strict kings than Britain, right? Well, more
Yeah,
powerful as an office kings than New
yeah,
Britain.
far more strict, far more absolute, and so it would have been that much harder to convince one of those kings to support your cause when the public justification for your cause is anti-king,
Yep.
right? So there, it's that the tone of it is very measured, and because the grievances all say he has or he has done this or he has done that, and they're focused on the king, it really obscures the fact that for the majority of the crisis from the Stamp Act up, the real grievance was fundamentally with Parliament,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it only becomes about the king sort of in uh, this very last stage of the crisis, because uh, most American colonists at this point accepted that Parliament had no authority, and so for the last year or so, it became about trying to get the king to step in and overturn this parliamentary legislation, which the king was never going to do. And so that's why the Declaration focuses on the king, not because he was the source of the crisis, but he was the focus of the crisis in this last stage,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's why the Declaration often gets misread as a sort of anti-monarchical document when that's really not what it is.
It's also hindsight, right? Like, as the revolution becomes more and more established and the fighting becomes more intense, and it takes on more small r republicanism. We're saying we don't like kings, right? The nature of fighting the war makes you not like the other side more, right?
Yeah.
You can see that in other conflicts. The Civil War. You can see that in America in its two world wars, right? It becomes more committed to fighting against the ideology that is opposed to over the course of the war once more people start dying. And I think the other thing that is also important to think about is it's also trying to get other colonies of Great Britain on the side, right? Like, this has happened to us. It could happen to you. Particularly, well, we don't want to get too much in the weeds, but Canada is one of the targets, but that kind of wasn't really working out. But Jamaica was the other big one, and other Caribbean islands that were wealthy and had influence in Parliament as well, by convincing them that, look, oh my God, domestic insurrections, all these other complaints, well, if that's happening in Virginia, that's happening in Massachusetts, it can definitely happen in Kingston, right? And that's another audience alongside the French, alongside the Spanish, that's really important to understand. And some of those people might be committed to the king. Like, you want to sort of make your coalition that could possibly join you at the beginning as big as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it's one of the great questions of the coming of the revolution is, not so much why didn't the French Catholics in Canada join the revolution, but why didn't the Caribbean colonies of Britain join in the revolution, right? When they were being subjected to the same legislation, and often had the same grievances as the colonists on the mainland. So, that's a great question. There's been interesting work done by a few historians in recent years that have tried to provide an answer, some kind of answer for that question, right? So I think you make a really excellent point that sort of transitions to thinking about the impact, because it very much is the case that the way the Declaration was perceived by Americans, who were really not its primary audience when it was initially passed and published, but for Americans, the way that they perceive that the Declaration has really changed over time, right? And I think that's something that's really important, to remember when we think about the Declaration of Independence. It's often easy to think that people at the time when it was passed thought about it the same way that we do today. That's absolutely not the case.
Right, like the famous language that we spend so much time talking about, and you see presidents, congresspeople, mayors quoting from, like, that really wasn't the important thing in 1776, or really throughout most of the period that covers the American Revolution. It's really once they have to once you have to start saying, well, what does the revolution mean? How are we going to
Yeah.
create a new government? And you start looking around for origins, and you start looking at what way for arguments to be made for your perspective. Well, the Declaration of Independence, it's the beginning, and it's a good place to start. And it has the advantage, of course. Jefferson is a good writer. There was some good editing going on, so that it was a good gift to make the arguments from. And of course,
I mean, go ahead.
oh yeah, and of course Thomas Jefferson himself is part of this, right? That's the important thing to also remember, right? Like, he's our third president. That's an important thing for students to keep in mind, right? He was not, you know, he was not some artist or some novelist or some poet or someone writing for a newspaper. He was an active politician, and he was involved in improving the memory of a document that he had a crucial role in the framing of. But go ahead, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, in some ways, and you're absolutely right that what the part of the document that mattered the most during the revolution itself was the grievances section, right? But it's that preamble and the introduction and the preamble. Very few people read the grievances or know the grievances anymore. But most people know the introduction or the preamble, and part of the reason for that, I think the document itself, the way that it's written, lends itself to that, right? The document is it has so many sort of layers to it. It's in some ways it's become sort of mythical in a way,
Mm-hmm.
but it's also history,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's it's poetry in some sense, right? It's also philosophy, right? I mean, you don't see a lot of poetic philosophy, right? It's universal in the introduction and the preamble, and then the grievances section is very distinctly of its time, right? So it's balancing all of these sort of competing, aspects of itself, and I think it's lent itself to uh, to being able to be many things to many different people, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we see that. I think we see that in fascinating ways in the history of the document after the revolution, right? It's really not until probably the 1820s that people start to talk about the Declaration in the kind of way that we do now, or that we have at least over the 20th century, in these sort of mythic terms. That took many decades for that perspective on the document to develop. Part of the reason that it happened then is because there was the semi-centennial, the 50-year anniversary of the revolution in 1826 of independence. Famously, John Adams, who was on the committee that drafted it, and Jefferson, who was the original drafter, both died on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after the Declaration was approved.
Couldn't write a better ending.
I mean, and then it's also in the very late 18 teens when John Trumbull's famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which he had originally done back in the 1780s, in a small version, when he was commissioned by the Congress to paint a number of scenes from the Revolution in very large sizes for the inside of the rotunda, the Capitol building. So it's in the early 1820s that painting goes on display, and that we start to really see prints of it circulate. So there's a sort of confluence of factors, right, that help to make the Declaration start to become the thing that we think of it as. And then I think moving on from there, it has a fascinating history after that, because as you go through the 19th century, building up to the Civil War, the Declaration of Independence became a sort of signpost in a way for some of our earliest activist movements, right? Mm-hmm. The abolitionist movement quoted the Declaration of Independence regularly, right? If we think about the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. This was a convention of the meeting of sort of what they called the women's rights movement, what we might think of as the sort of feminist movement today, the origins of the modern feminist movement, and they put out their own Declaration of Independence that basically used the exact same language as the Declaration
and format. It has its grievances section
and format, absolutely, but declaring independence for women, right? And we see that all through into the 20th century. We see civil rights leaders in the 1950s and 1960s, quoting the Declaration. Even the Communist Party of the United States, quoted the Declaration in its propaganda and promotional materials in the 1930s and 1940s. And so it can be many things to many people. And there's a fascinating book that was written a few years ago by a historian at Harvard named David Armitage. That's a sort of global history of the Declaration of Independence. And what he found was, many instances of liberation movements throughout the world. Later in the 19th century and throughout the 20th century, quoting the Declaration of Independence, right, as part of their liberatory.
Vietnam did it, as he points out in that book. The Vietnamese Declaration of Independence is formatted after the American. And even going up to like history that my students will know is, you can look at both inaugural speeches by Barack Obama use language from the Declaration of Independence, but of course also his biggest critics, they called themselves the Tea Party movement, but also many of their, personalities in Congress and on television would quote the Declaration of Independence and as a totem, right? Where you have, that's within the memory of, people who were born in the 21st century, right? It's not something that just, us sitting here, people who are, late 20th century people. It's something that has reverberation here in the 21st century. And I think it's a really difficult thing, I think, to wrap your brain around. I don't think that historians have 100% of a good, understanding of why that's the case. I think it is one of those things that is like myth. It just becomes part of the oxygen for better and for worse. Like the 1619 Project also talks about the Declaration of Independence and quotes from it, while also being extremely critical of America's founding. Right? It's in the oxygen of what it means to be an American. This document is one of our biggest exports. Right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we've seen. I think just even over our late 20th century sort of lifetimes, we've seen the way people think about the Declaration change over time, right? It's really, now I think it's very common when I'm teaching college students, if we're talking about the Declaration of Independence, to bring up, the fact that Jefferson was a slaveholder when he wrote the all men are created equal line, and that's a sort of fundamental hypocrisy, right? That has that really resonates with people now in a way that it didn't 30, 40 years ago, and certainly beyond 50 years ago. So it's a good example of how each generation sort of contemporary perspective and their own specific contexts, shape how they view, right, with the Declaration, to some extent the Constitution, and just the Revolution generally, right? I've sort of been surprised when I teach the Declaration of Independence. I find often that students that many students have not read the Declaration of Independence yet. But I often ask, what does the Declaration of Independence mean to you as a post-millennial, I guess, right?
Zillennial, I think, is the term.
What is it?
Zillennial is the term I've heard thrown around.
Really?
Yes. Generation Z.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And I asked, is is the Declaration of Independence relevant to you? I like to ask them, and I think the vast majority of students, the vast majority of times that I've asked the question, have said no, that it's not relevant to them. And I think a big part of that goes to, the fact that Jefferson was the original drafter,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, and I have to say, I mean, as a historian of the revolution, as a historian of the memory of the revolution, I find myself a little disappointed by that, partly because I think, you know, uh, I think I think that part of what's missing, I think what people often, and certainly today, miss about the Declaration of Independence is just how radical the ideas in it are, right? The
Mm-hmm.
idea of equality, we think, I mean, it's a self-evident thing to us, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in the 18th century, equality was not something that was not an accepted idea, right? The colonists came from Britain. Britain was a decidedly, hierarchically organized, society with a rigid class structure, right? Similarly, rigid class structures throughout Europe. This idea of equality was a really radical idea, as was the idea that if your government is not, protecting your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that you have the right uh, to abolish that government,
Yeah.
right? That Think about how radical that idea is, right? I mean, it's almost hard to think of a more radical idea than that. Historians tend to refer to it as the right to revolution, right? If the government is not protecting your rights, then you have the right to throw it off. I mean, that too is a very radical idea, and I think sometimes the radicalness of the document is obscured by who wrote it, um, and is sort of lost over time. But
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it makes it. Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I think from my point of view, I think that the Declaration is as contradictory as the country that it helped
Yeah.
create, where
Yeah.
there's tensions within it, where, as you were pointing out, there's these radical moments, right?
Yeah.
And radical lines, like all men are created equal, right? You can read it literally, men like you or I, or in the human term, but that is a radical statement for the 18th century, and to be honest, it's a radical statement in the 21st century as well,
Absolutely.
sometimes, right?
Absolutely.
But
I think
then
that's. Go ahead.
but then of course we can get to the grievances section that we talked about, which is, as you pointed out, a very 18th century part of it, and it gets into the gobbledygook of the revolution and the society that existed at that time. It's where you see racial inequality baked into the argument for this radical movement to throw off a king, right? It's a document that reads the contradictions of our society that have existed since the 18th century into the 21st, into this foundational text.
Yeah, that's an absolutely fantastic point. I mean, it is the idea of of equality. It really is just almost just as radical today, right? If we think about all the inequality that we see in our society, in our politics, it just or just in the world generally, right? The concrete idea of equality is still quite radical. We are still miles away from even approaching achieving it. I think the the issue of hypocrisy on Jefferson's part, I mean, it's really undeniable, right? And I think that it raises this fascinating question that historians have tried to answer now for decades, which is, how is it possible? How is it possible that a Virginia slave owner
Mm-hmm.
could write those words in the first place, right? How is it possible that a society that is made up or that is in many ways, built on, the backs of the institution of slavery, right, would have this revolution based on a rhetoric of liberty, right? How are we supposed to understand that contradiction? And I think, I mean, there's, I think it's up to every American to try to answer that question for themselves. I think it's part of reckoning with the memory of the revolution as a citizen. But, if we think, I mean, when I look at the Declaration, I see it not as a statement of what was the case at the time, right? But I see it more as an idyllic statement, right? As saying this is how it should be, right? And I mean, we all have ideals in our personal lives that that we hold important, but that we don't necessarily always live up to, right?
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
one of the examples that I give to my students is, um, think about how 200 years from now, people will look back and think about, this generation and the issue of climate change, right? They might say, well, they talked a good game about how important it was and how important it was to, get, move away from fossil fuels and everything. But, how many people gave up all the comforts and conveniences that come from fossil fuels, right?
Yeah,
how many of
us
refuse to drive cars? How many of us, don't engage in any transportation except bicycles effectively? How much, so in that sense, we as a society today still have, these ideals that we profess, and we mean it when we profess them, but we don't always live up to them, and I think it, this is not to absolve Jefferson in any way, or the slave owners in colonial America in any way, but I think that it's worth thinking about how we might be perceived in the future, before we render sort of judgments about people in the past. We will be, it's inevitable that their generations from now will look back at us and see some things that we think are perfectly fine, and they will be utterly appalled that we put up with those things, or that we engaged in those behaviors, and I think it's just a good reminder, that of how important empathy is as a part of historical thinking, I think.
Yeah, and may we all be so lucky that future generations are better than we are. But I want to double back, because I think that your point earlier, that I think the contradictions, the ideas and reality of this document are something that we all need to reckon with as citizens, is a really good place to end this discussion, because I think we've covered basically all the points that I wanted to make sure that my students were prepared to sort of think about and write about the Declaration of Independence. So again, I want to thank you, Dr. Hattem, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
And this was great. Kids, make sure that you look at the study questions. They'll be based on this video, and that you use this to inform your work in the third checkpoint. And otherwise, everybody, please stay safe and stay healthy with everything that's going on in these trying times.
Good luck and be safe, everyone.